Hey folks, it's Bear Gardener, and welcome to yet another cards video. I did say in my last video I'm back, and I'm kind of back with a bit more energy because we're starting to see information on the September balance patch. So the patch itself is due on September the 19th. I am recording on September the 10th, so we've got just over a week before this patch will land. As ever, I am a Kards Content Creator, a member of the Kards Contributor Program. You can find me at all the stuff down below. I'm not hard to find. You can join my Discord with the link in chat, and description rather. All of that to one side. Balance patches, I always try and explain these as I go because my content's primarily aimed at new players. What is a balance patch? Balance patches are little adjustments in which cards are changed or rotated out or back in again. So cards, if you're familiar with other card games, you might see rotation or expansion changes where cards are just removed from the game entirely. Cards technically never does that. Cards get moved to the reserve pool and then may come back later. So there's a rotation. So each of these rotations and balance patches is usually aimed to address what's going on. If you want to know what's going on in the meta, check my last video. I'll put a link in the doobly-doo to see what I think about some of what's going on and some of the questions I was asked about decks that are going around. We've had... this is going to be like part one of this. I think there's going to be 2 or 3 parts to my coverage of this, just depending on when information comes out and when I get time to record. So this first part, we're going to talk about what we've seen. So far we've seen a teaser of the balance patch, literally 2 cards which are being changed, and then we've seen, excuse me, the cards which are returning to the game from the reserve pool. So I'm going to dive right in, and I'm going to talk to you about what we've seen so far. So first of all, let's go and have a look at the teaser from the balance patch. So this is what we've received as a teaser from the balance patch. On the right-hand side, I have the original cards. On the left-hand side, I have the teased reveal. So the 2 cards that are getting changed that we've seen. There will be more. This will not be the only balance change. It never is. But the 2 cards that we've seen teasers of the change for are the B24J, which is the American bomber, which is related to Production Order and Bomber Mafia because it is a token. It is only spawnable. You can't run this in your decks. So it is relevant to be aware of that. It's relevant to be aware that it's not a card that you can include in a deck. You can only get it by spawning it. And Stubborn Defense, which is a Polish order. So let's take a look at them. I'm going to start with Stubborn Defense, which I think is a good place to start. So the original Stubborn Defense is a 0 cost order, which says when an enemy attacks your unit, give your unit +2 defense. It's a standard card. It's a 0 cost order. It didn't see really a lot of play at all. It has value because obviously it is a countermeasure. Rather, I should say it is a countermeasure, not an order. That was my misspeak. It is a Polish countermeasure, which... So I say, when an enemy attacks your unit gets +2 defense. This did not see a huge amount of play. It's fine, but Poland is a relatively strong ally with some very specific themes, and I don't think Stubborn Defense really fitted hugely into it. The change is interesting. So the cost remains the same. It remains a countermeasure, obviously, but now we get when an enemy unit attacks your unit, give your unit +1 defense and draw a card if your unit survives. This makes Stubborn Defense considerably more worth looking at because it tutors it cantrips. it replaces itself, which is never a bad thing. As soon as it triggers, one of the downsides with countermeasures, there are several downsides to countermeasures. First, obviously, unless they're zero cost, you can play around them. Stubborn defense has the advantage of being zero cost, so your opponent, the way countermeasures work, by the way, if you don't know, which I should be clear about, is you hold up a countermeasure on your turn by paying the cost for it, which means you can't spend those credits in your turn, which means your opponent can see that you have unspent credits. That means if your opponent knows the list of available countermeasures, they can take a pretty good guess at what countermeasure you might be holding up and play around it. So, for example, if they think you're holding up From the Deep, which is a countermeasure in Germany that destroys the next unit they deploy, they drop something very cheap and then carry on with their turn as normal, minimising their losses. Stubborn defense and any other zero-cost countermeasure has the advantage that you can't tell whether it's being held up or not because your opponent doesn't have to keep credits. That said, at just +2 defense, it still wasn't good enough to see play. At +1 defense and draw a card if the unit survives, is it going to see play? I truly don't know. Poland is a very specific ally and has some very good cards in it. I don't know whether this will see play, but it's certainly a change that makes the card better, in my opinion, than it was. Moving on to the B24J. So first of all, Production order has its own history. Production order is the only way well, technically it's not the only way, but one of the ways you can get this card. As I say, this is a token card. You'll notice it has no rarity on it. That's because you can't play this in your deck. You can only get it through cards that create it. The original card that created this is Production Order. This is a 1-cost order that allows you to choose between this and the B24D. The B24D is the more aggressive Blitz version of this that gets a discount if you control a unit with an op cost of 4 or more, or 3 or more rather, but ultimately you choose between the two, and this one without Blitz has a suppression effect. We'll get to that in a minute. Anyway, the only way that you can get this, only 2 ways really, that you can get this is through the Production order, but you can also get it through Bomber Mafia. Now, Bomber Mafia is a card that may or may not see a change in this balance patch. I do not know. I do not have advance information. I have not seen the information. It would be my hope that it will, even though it has already been nerfed once, because it's an incredibly strong card. Not going to get into that in too much detail, but this adjustment is to do with just how strong that particular function has been, how powerful these spawned bombers are. B24J, the original B24J, is a 7-cost, 3-op cost, 6/5 bomber that's set. It has heavy armor 1, so it takes 1 less damage from combat sources, but not from orders. And it has deployment, suppress all enemy units. Now, suppress is the mechanic that resets a unit's stats to their default state unless they've been damaged, in which case they keep the damage, turns off all of their text effects, and basically it's an incredibly potent tool. Removes things like guard, removes all the massive buffs that you can get on something like a Sissy Sasto or a buffed up tank that your opponent's blitzing your front line with. And B24J is amazing because it clears every buff on the board for your opponent. It suppresses everything. This is an incredibly strong effect and becoming more and more prevalent as a choice. The change is pretty simple. B24J now says exactly the same thing all the way down, except on its deployment effect, which is deployment suppress target enemy unit and adjacent units. This is a big change. This is theoretically a huge nerf. It's still strong. This will still see play. This is still a potent tool. It will still be very nice to see it off Bomber Mafia, which is why Bomber Mafia kind of needs an alteration, but that's a different video and a different conversation. But it's way less powerful than it was because you now have to figure out where to target, and to a degree you can play around it if you know your opponent's running production order, or you suspect they are, you can, or Bomber Mafia, which, I mean, realistically, if they have US, they're running one and or both of them. They're just too good not to, at the moment. I will say, I like this change. Anything that will lighten down the impact of Production Order and Bomber Mafia will never go down badly with me at the minute, with how prevalent US ramp is. Ramp, for those who don't know, is the US mechanic whereby you use cards that increase your available credit slots so that eventually late in the game you have ridiculous numbers of credits available every turn and are therefore able to do huge amounts, drop big units, and this is an incredibly potent tool in that because it can neuter all of your opponent's threats, so you have even longer to whittle your opponent down with bombers. Plus, it's a good body. Let's not miss the fact that yes, it's 3 operation cost, but it's 6 damage. This is something I talk about with big bombers on a regular basis, because I think it's something that sometimes people miss, is in effect, unless you have a fighter on the board, a bomber like this is the equivalent of a 3-cost order that deals 6 damage to any target, including the enemy HQ. That's not nothing. And you need fighters or removal to deal with it. It's repeatable, as long as it stays alive, and this thing has 5 defense and heavy armor 1. Anyway, my point is that I like this change. Do I think it's gonna... is it enough of a change? I'm not sure it is. I think I'm interested to see what comes, but then these are teasers. This is literally just a teaser of what the balance patch has done, and I think that's pretty cool. I think it's nice that we've seen it. I like the direction of these changes. I'm excited to do the video later, which will be the second part of this, where I look at those changes when we see the announcement of all of the balance patch changes, but that's, as of now, probably a couple of days away. And I will be, you will see a video from me, I would hope, by the end of the week on that. As soon as I have the information, I will be trying to carve time to make said video. That said, let's move on to the actual meat of what we've seen. So, that was a nice little sneak peek of what the balance patch might look like, but the meat of what we're going to see is going to be the rotations. In this particular case, the returning cards. Cards which are coming back into the game, and it's using 1939's new habit, which I quite like, of changing the cards that are returning a bit, to either refresh them or rebalance them, addressing issues or making them either more balanced, more functional, that sort of thing. Realistically, I will always like this as a method because I think it makes sense on rotation. So, first of all, before we dig into this in too much detail, I am not a complete veteran of this game. I've not been around forever, so there are going to be cards here that I can only assess the old version on based on the text and what the card says, because I have not actually necessarily seen all of these in play in the time that I've been playing the game. I've been playing the game a little under a year. My 1-year anniversary in this game's coming up, but anyway, but what I will do is I'll talk about what I think about the changes. We will go nation by nation. Each main nation is getting 3 returning cards in this article, and then each ally nation other than Finland is getting 1 returning card. Finland isn't getting a returning card because there are no Finland cards in the reserve pool. Nothing has been rotated out yet because Finland is a new ally. So that means that we are seeing a good pile of cards, so let's dig in and talk about them. Right, time to look at the first British card, and this is Tactical Withdrawal. So, Tactical Withdrawal is returning. All of these will look the same way. On the left-hand side, you will see the original version, the version currently in the reserve pool. On the right-hand side, you will see the version which is coming back into the game on the 19th of September 2024. Tactical Withdrawal, the original version, was, aside from anything else, it's got a lion on it. Come on, who doesn't love a lion? 1 cost order. It's limited, so you can run 3 of them. All friendly units in the front line retreat and are fully repaired. This is terrible. This is a straight up terrible card. I'm sure someone will correct me if there were certain decks that did with it, but yes, you're fully repairing all of your units, but you're also giving up the front line, so then you're going to have to trade with them to go forward again, and I can't imagine that this was ever particularly effective. Yes, it's cheap, but ugh, no, not great. The new version, however, is really interesting. So this is a 1 cost order still. This one says, retreat a friendly unit in the front line, just 1, fully repair it. It can operate again this turn. Okay, so let's be clear about the kind of hijinks you can pull with this. Let's take the Humber. Please let's, and be aware of just how ridiculous this card can get. The Humber is a cheap tank that has Fury, which means it can attack twice in a turn, as long as you can pay the operation cost. Tactical Withdrawal will be relevant in a moment. So let us assume we have a Humber on the front line, and we've buffed it so that it's... Let's keep it moderate. Let's say we've gotten like a couple of buffs on it, and it's a 3-attack Humber. So we plink the Humber, does 3 damage. We plink the Humber again, does another 3 damage. Then we pay 1 credit for Tactical Withdrawal, which retreats the Humber to the support line, repairs it, and then allows it to operate again this turn, which lets us put it forward into the front line again. It's tank, so it can move and attack on the same turn, so it can then attack twice again. So for both of those attacks doing 3 damage, which is another 6, which is for a total of 12. So mathematics then comes into it. Assuming the Humber has an operation cost of 1, we haven't reduced it somehow, for a grand total of, what are we on? 2 to attack the first 2 times, 1 to play Tactical Withdrawal, then another 1 to move forward, takes us to 4. So for a total of 6 credits, we can do 12 damage to HQ. This is really good. Really, really good. That's just one example of what you can do with this. This is a card which is going to see play in some really interesting Brit OTK decks. There are many, many really fun things you can do with this. I'm not even going to begin to dig into what they all are. But the fact that this resets the operation counter on a unit is huge. And cool. Do I think it's ridiculously overpowered? Probably not. I think it's more likely to be seen in OTK and meme decks than it is going to be seen super heavy play. That said, with the right support, this could build a whole new archetype for a much more aggressive Britain, which I would love to see, because I love Britair, many know this, but it'd be nice to be able to play some more ground-based stuff, and there's some pretty cool stuff you can do with this as long as you have Blitz. Or some other way of getting back at using a reset operation cost. On the whole, I think this is pretty cool. I quite like this. I think it's quite exciting as orders go. As ever, I'm always cautious about anything that has such a cheap cost for such a strong impact as to how much it's going to end up. Like, be clear, someone is going to find a way to abuse the life out of this, because that's what happens when you have things like this. It's part of the fun of building OTK decks, but I'm not sure it's going to be like meta-dominatingly broken, but it's very strong. Anyway, that's the first British returning card, Tactical Withdrawal, which is more like tactical repair and charge, which I quite like. I think it's quite cool. Let's move on to the next one. And here is the next one. This is the Cromwell Mk IV. So, this is a tank. Let's look at the original. It's a special, so you run 2 of them, or can. Let's take a look at, by the way, cool bridge art in the back. Again, the art on this is very funky, but focus there. The original Cromwell Mk IV, the one that is currently sitting in the reserve pool, is a 4 cost, 2 operation cost, 3/6 heavy armor, 1 tank. Which is a kind of solid body. And it has give Cromwell a Mk IV +2 attack when a pinned enemy is destroyed. And yeah, I'm going to read that again, just slowing it down, because this is one of those, I'll get to this in a minute. But anyway, give Cromwell Mk IV +2 attack when a pinned enemy is destroyed. This is a nice attack buff, but ludicrously situational. It requires that you're running pin. It requires that you're running pin and then destroying a pinned unit, which is not actually normally what you're doing with pin. Normally with pin you're actually delaying for a different win condition. So I imagine this did see some play, but I can't imagine it saw much of anything. It doesn't have blitz, it has 2 operation cost, it's just a big body, but it can largely be ignored. The new version is still same cost, it's still a special card, it's still 4 cost, 2 op cost tank. This one is A35, so it's lost a point of defense, so already we're expecting something interesting about the rest of this card, and we are getting it. This tank now gets guard and heavy armor 1, so it keeps its heavy armor, but gets guard for 1 less point of defense. This is now a 3/5 guard at 4 cost, which is not terrible. Really isn't. It's a pretty decent body. It's considering it's kind of like a mini tank version of the Glamour Boys, but without the health upgrade. It's a decent guard body with a decent attack on it. That said, in guards, I'm always going to value defense over attack, but still interesting. Anyway, the new text is fascinating. When an enemy unit is pinned, suppress it. Right. So this is interesting because this triggers stacking effects. Now, this is not... On the face of this looks terribly, terribly indifferent. There are a number of reasons that, in my opinion, it's not, and could be a card that you might see teched in some tournaments and decks purely for the card text, if you're going into the late game, and I shall explain why. There's a lot of increase and buff going around in the game right now. There always has been a fair chunk, and there's even more now, of different effects and things that can be dropped on units that are surprisingly good, which is one of the reasons that the US is particularly popular at the moment, because it has been the only nation with access to the suppress mechanic. We're starting to see, and they talk about this in the article, trying to put smatterings of suppress out into other nations, and I've been on record, and I will stay on record as saying that suppress is something that needs to be treated with a degree of caution because of how powerful it is, how much it can swing a game. But I'm not surprised to see them attempting to trickle it out into other nations. I am pleasantly surprised that in this case they've done it in a very, very particular way. This is not direct suppression. It requires that you pin. So immediately you could argue this thing, it might just not be good. I mean, look, I'm paying 4 cost to put a tank on the board, and yes, it's a guard, but come on, I've got a pin to do the thing. Remember the nation you're playing here. So Britain has access to, in my opinion, 3 exceptionally good pin cards. I mean, it has a number of good cards. There are plenty of pin cards in the game, but Britain in particular has access to 3 good ones. There is naval power. Naval power will pin an enemy unit and give you HQ defense. 3 HQ defense, in fact. In this case, it will now, for 1 cost, pin an enemy unit, give you 3 HQ defense, and suppress the enemy unit. So not only are you slowing that unit down, you're neutering any of its powerful effects. That's pretty good. Great for Pathfinders. Like, normally you're looking for removal as Britain if you get US and they pop down Pathfinders. With this, you're just like, yeah, I'll pin you. Kind of a bonus, slows you down a bit. You can't get the body into the front line, and then you've just got a useless 2/2 body that does nothing. That you need to get rid of somehow. Pretty cool. We also have, you'll forgive me, my memory is my memory with my illness, but Britain has the pin enemy unit, draw a card. This is fantastic. It will hopefully be appearing down here with the actual name when I get round to doing the edit, but I can't remember the name off the top of my head. That happens. Welcome to neurological issues. But that, again, is a good card. And let's not forget, indeed, the Commandos. We have Commando Raid, which is pin an enemy unit and deploy a number 10 commando. Or in this case, pin an enemy unit, suppress it, deploy a number 10 commando, and then profit later by being able to continue every time you pin something with the funky pin orders, also pinging commando damage everywhere. I expect that some people are at least going to play around with this. The one thing I will say, the one thing that is a little limiting about this is the cost. I think that's probably quite sensible given how powerful effect it is, but the fact that it's 4 cost is a thing. Still, it's a decent guard with heavy armour, not nothing, and it has a very good effect on the text. I wonder if people might sleep on this for a while and then come across it and wish they hadn't. On the whole, I like this change. I think it takes what was a ridiculously situational thing that no one cared about. Like, the most meaningful change on this card, to me, is the addition of the guard keyword. Because it makes the unit worth something on its own, not just its text effect. The previous iteration of Cromwell, even if the text effect was good, was a lot of money for a largely useless body, because I do not like the fact that it's 2 operation cost, because 2 operation cost tanks are fine, but that's very slow. What I like about this is that guard makes the body something you have to do something with because it has a function. On the whole, I like this card, and I think it will also fit into a more aggressive British archetype. We might see Britain getting a bit more actual ground unit based, as opposed to seeing an awful lot of Brit air, or just Brit being played for control. Anyway, I like this change. It's pretty cool. On to the next one. Okay, so third British card and final British card is the Royal West Kent. This is interesting to me on many levels. So let's take a look. So the Royal West Kents is a British infantry unit. The version which is currently, it's a limited unit, so you can run 3 of them. The version currently labouring in reserve is 4 cost, 1 op cost, 2/4 infantry. This is already not looking good. And when a friendly guard unit is attacked, it deals damage equal to its defence. This card is bicycle spokes, to use the old MTG Britain version of this. This card is useful for putting in your bicycle wheel to make an interesting noise. I have nothing else to say. Someone might come back and tell me it's interesting, but realistically, I come on. Yes, okay, guards tend to have a big defence, but I do not want to be paying to put a unit that is basically awful because it doesn't have guard itself onto the ground to just sit in my support line, taking up a space that could actually contain either another guard or whatever tools I'm trying to use to win the game, just to make my guards a bit scarier. It's a terrible card. Right, let's see if they've polished it up enough that it's interesting. Spoilers, they have. The returning version of Royal West Kents. 4 cost, 1 op cost, 4/4. Huge buff already. Blitz. It's getting bigger. Guard. Interesting. Guard and Blitz. And then you get to the text. Your other guard units have +2 attack and Blitz. This is a huge offensive tool for Britain. This is a mid-game value card, which is something I'm always going to like. What do I mean by a mid-game value card? This is what I would call, from the dinosaur days of Magic the Gathering, a true mid-range card. The effect of this card sits right in the mid-range of the game. You are playing this on turn 5 because you want to blitz it. Or later. But you're probably not playing it turn 10 or later because the game's probably over by then. Mid-range. Its effect is all mid-range. It takes your guards, which have been sat protecting you, and turns them into offensive tools. This is cool, and it means every guard you deploy after it also gets blitz, and +2 attack. I really like this card. I don't know how strong it's going to be. I don't know whether it's going to be strong enough to build a whole new archetype, But I like the card, I like the theming of the card, and I like the archetype that it's trying to enable, which is the idea that you soak using your guards and high defense units until you can push back. Again, this fits in with things like Tactical Withdrawal and Cromwell Mk IV. These are all kind of fitting into a similar thing, which is allowing you to play a much more value-based game. Cromwell quite directly, because it has guard, heavy armour, and has the ability to take advantage of pins to suppress the enemy, giving you early options if you can get it out. I mean, the only downside with these is cost. Late game in cards is very difficult to do without some form of credit acceleration because so many decks are very fast. But we'll see. Britain's got some cheap guards, which might see some more play. And of course, Tactical Withdrawal means that you can do all sorts of shenanigans with pushing forward, doing a chunk of damage, and then retreating a unit and pushing it forward again. There's all sorts you can do that. It's interesting. I see where they're going. Do I think it's good enough to be top meta? That's very debatable, as I say. I don't know it's going to be fast enough, but I like it. Because it feels like what I want Britain to do. And that's important. So that's Britain. Those are the three cards that we've seen. I like them. I like the direction they're going in. I look forward to seeing whether they see some play or not. Next nation. Right, first Germany card. It's an order. So this is Suppression. This is a one-cost order. Let's take a look at the reserve version. This is a standard card, so you can run 4 copies of this. So the original Suppression is a one-cost order, and it says all enemy units have -3 attack this turn. Yeah, big whoop. This is a stave off your... It's like anti-Blitzkrieg. This is a stave off your death card, and almost certainly did not see a huge amount to play because you don't want to be paying to... Like, sure, it can buy you a turn, but you've got to really believe that you can do something with that turn. And you've got to believe that you're playing it on the right turn and your opponent can't buff through it. Because, of course, you can just... Your opponent, if they've got the credits, can cancel this. If they've got lethal on the board and then you play this, and then they have Blitzkrieg or something similar in hand, they can just completely cancel it and rip through you anyway. Not a great order, in my humble opinion. Again, I'm sure some people will correct me and tell me it was somehow played massively in meta at some point for its sheer control value, but yeah, I'm unimpressed. The new version is a 1-credit order, and it says, suppress a target unit, draw a card if you have an air unit. Right, stage 1, I love the theme of this card. Before we get into the noodle of the mechanics of this card, I adore the theme of this card, because you look at the artwork, you consider the inspiration from the way that the Luftwaffe used infantry support strafing runs, and you realise that this card is very on theme, which is always nice to see. I always like to see that lean in this game, where we do still see things that fit theme. I like the fact that they're using a keyword that they've added to the game that this already has the name of, because why wouldn't you? I'm a little cagey about another nation having direct access to suppress on such a universal level, by which I mean you can run 4 of them. However, it does cost 1 credit, which means that compared to Duress, which by the way doesn't see that much high-level play because most people would rather have an M10 because it has a body on it, this card is more expensive. But it does have secondary effect, which I like. Situational secondary effects like this encourage the building of decks that interact, interlocking pieces and puzzles, and I love that. This means that if you have an air unit on the board, you then get to cantrip. You can draw a card off this. That's good value. 1 cost, suppress a target unit, draw a card, is a lot better than 1 cost, suppress a target unit. If you want to see how good one cost to draw a card with some cool other effect is, take a look at For Freedom, and that's a special. Granted, it's a buff, not a debuff, but this is a good card. I would expect that this will see some play, because this is just a good tool to have in your deck to allow you to deal with things and frees you up to not have to look at US as an ally to get suppress access if you want to play a more mid-range or trading game. Personally, I love it, think it's good. One little tiny thing on the end of it, though, is the cautionary tale of watching how much suppress we add into the game. Just a thing. Given it to do again, I might have made this a limited card. If I were 1939 and I was bringing this back out, I know they don't change card rarity and I know why, but if you're bringing it back out, you're changing it anyway. Maybe. But anyway, it's not the end of the world, and I actually think it's quite cool. I think it's going to be a useful tool for Germany. I don't have a major objection. Second Germany returning card is another order. This is Breakthrough. Okay, so Breakthrough was a 3-cost order, limited, so you can play 3 of them, and it said, remove guard, ambush, and smokescreen from all enemy units, draw a card. Massive debuff, draw a card. I mean, okay, so let's look at this kind of calculatively. Being able to remove guard and ambush, mostly relevant. Smokescreen, kinda less so. Ambush, even less so. The big one is removing guard. But it's 3 cost. Yes, it's all enemy units, but how often are you going to see the board that has enough of these keywords? So this is kind of 3 cost to draw a card and turn off a guard. Back in the day, when we didn't have access to Duress or an M10A1, this might have been quite good, but really, I think it's just too situational and expensive. The new version is a 3-cost order, and it says, deal 3 damage to a target unit. If it is destroyed, your units operate for 1 less this turn. Now, I have often spoken about the importance of operation cost in this game. Operation cost is an important limiting factor, in particular when dealing with tanks, because operation cost is in effect doubled for a blitz tank. Because not only do you need to deploy it and move it forward, you also need to attack with it, which means that, for example, a 2-cost tank that has a 1 operation cost and blitz doesn't want to do anything until turn 4, because you want to put it down, push it forward, and attack. Being able to reduce operation cost in this game is not nothing. It is incredibly potent if timed well. I personally think this is rather strong. 3 damage to a target unit. That's decent damage. That could do just enough damage to make a guard removable. And that is the thing, because then you trigger the if it's destroyed, your units operate for 1 less this turn. So you open your turn with a strong front line. I mean, this plus Blitzkrieg, if you've got big tanks somehow into the front line, could be huge. This is the other thing, is that Blitzkrieg already kind of does something similar. This is sort of an inverse version of it. Blitzkrieg increases all of your units' damage by 3 and reduces their operation cost by 1, but only for the units in the front line. This deals 3 damage to a target unit. If you destroy it, all of your units operate for -1 cost this turn. Now, this is interesting because this also means that it can speed up artillery and bombers and fighters. It can speed up your support line, and that's not nothing in this game either, because being able to plink away for free, like a whole turn of backline fire supporting the front line, is not nothing. This is, in the right deck, a good card. However, it's a card you have to build around, and I've said this about previous cards that we're talking about, and yeah, I like that. I like that this requires you to build around it. I think it's pretty cool. I look forward to playing around with it. I don't know how strong it will end up being, but I would keep an eye on it, because I think it's stronger than some people might think. Right, last but by no means least, we have the Pak 40. And Pak 40 is a artillery. So the original version, the one languishing in the reserve pool, is a 4-cost, 1-op cost, 2-2 artillery with ambush. It's limited, so 3 of them. And it does triple damage to tanks. I mean, it fits the theme of what the Pak 40 was. Go forth, Google. Tank busting is the thing, and triple damage to tanks, 6 damage to a tank is pretty strong, but at 4-cost, 1-op cost, this isn't great. It's very slow. It doesn't have blitz, so it can't fire until its next turn, which means it needs to rely on ambush to actually do it, but it's only doing 2 damage, so you can remove it with a piece of infantry. It's only got 2 health, so you can remove it very easily with things. It's not a great card. The new Pak 40 is still 4-cost, still 1-op cost, still 2-2, and still has ambush, so it's still fairly underwhelming. However, its text is awesome. Deployment: destroy target enemy unit that costs 2 or less. Draw a card if it's a tank. Right, this is bonkers strong. This is a very, very good card. Any form of removal in this game is strong. There are plenty of very aggressive decks that run tanks. This thing targets and draws off of... First and foremost, you do not want to do this just to destroy the unit. You want the draw. This is an anti-tank piece of equipment. But there are times at which it's still going to be worth it to play it just to destroy an infantry or an aircraft. That has 2 cost or less, particularly if you're playing against, for example, Brit Air, with a massively buffed via Sea Embargo and Cass, Gladiator or Swordfish. Pop! However, this is beautiful into Japan aggro, Germany, ironically against Germany's own aggro tank, the Panzer 35T. This is perfect. Drop it, pop the 35T, no one cares about the buffs, draw a card. And you've got a 2-2 1-op cost artillery. It's not bad. I think this card will see play. I quite like it. I think removal is always strong. I'm always cautious about too much removal being added to a game like this. It is expensive. I wouldn't be at all surprised if there weren't some calls to maybe reduce its cost a little, but it compares quite favourably with Flampanzer, which is also a very good card. Kind of bear's tip on this. Don't sleep on this card. Keep your eye on it. Okay, so here we go. First Japan unit. This is the Shibata Regiment. Firstly, very cool piece of Japanese. I think it's a war poster art, but it's very cool. My kanji's not good enough to translate it, but it's very cool to see and I like it. Anyway, moving on. The version of Shibata Regiment currently sitting in the reserve pool is a 1-cost, 1-op cost, 1-2 Blitz Infantry. It's a standard card. And it says at the start of your turn, give this unit +3 attack and deal 1 damage to it. This is terrible. Moving on. I mean, it is. Like, on the face of it, +3 attack, so for 1 turn, it's a 4 attack blitz unit. But the problem is it's infantry. So you put it down, push it forward. Next turn, it deals a damage to itself and becomes 4 attack, assuming your opponent hasn't removed it. The turn after that, it dies, unless you can buff it. It's not overwhelming. It's a very aggressive tool, but no, it doesn't light the world on fire. New version, time to retool. This is a 1-1, still a 1-1 infantry. It's 1-3, so it's gained a point of defense. It's lost blitz, so now we're starting to think, what is this going to get that is useful? And we get, when the enemy gives an order, deal 2 damage to the enemy HQ. Okay, so this is the first card that I've seen in this that I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on because it is mostly underwhelming to me. In the right situation, this is hypothetically quite good. Against an Orders heavy deck, great. But the problem is, 1, it's not a great body, 2, it's easily removable, and 3, it's occupying a slot in your deck that you'd really just rather have something else in. I wait to be proven wrong, but I find this card tremendously underwhelming. I really don't think we'll see much of this unless there is some major support for this countering orders with damage archetype. Just my thoughts, but anyway, moving on. Right, hello Outmaneuver. Okay, so this is a card that is interesting. Firstly, I really like the art, but that's not a surprise in the game. The old version of Outmaneuver. 2-cost order. It's a limited. You can run 3 of them. Target unit is immune to damage until the start of your next turn. Okay. That's way too expensive to be useful. I'm just being honest. It's not that the effect isn't powerful. Hypothetically, it is. But realistically, you've got to operate that unit to take advantage of it. Meh. It's just not great. Moving on to the new version, which is completely different. Really very different. Outmaneuver is now a 1-cost order, and it says, target Japanese unit has 0 operation cost this turn. If it has smokescreen, it gets +2/+2. Right, okay. So this is going in a direction that I'm not going to talk overly about now because we need to see a few more cards, which I suspect this is one of the cards. There was an allusion in the article to the fact that a few of these cards might be giving us an idea of what's coming in the next expansion. This tells me that the next expansion is almost certainly going to contain support for this new smokescreen style archetype, and I love that. Because new archetypes and new ideas like this and new deck tribal feels make me happy. I'm very pleased to see that. In the meantime, this is a largely indifferent order. Not because of its lack of being useful in the sense that it's got a good effect. It does have a good effect, but its limiting factor is that it targets Japanese units with smokescreen. I mean, it might. Aichi is still a card, not that anyone plays it. Shock Attack's out there, so you could stack this with Shock Attack, but that's very expensive. Beyond that, the only units we've got that are particularly interesting for smokescreen are some very slow and expensive infantry and the Horo. This is the thing, that this is going to need more support to be good. Doesn't mean it's not going to be good, and I like the direction it's going in. At the moment, it's niche. What I like is that it is pointing us in the direction of what the next expansion could be, and I find that interesting. Anyway, on to the next Japan card, which is probably going to be more of a talking point. Okay, so this is the last card from Japan, and we are definitely on last but not least. I'm going to talk about this one probably in some detail. Warning, maths may be incoming. This is the 144th Infantry Regiment. Right, let's deal with the old version. It's a limited infantry, 3 cost, 1 op cost. It's 4/3, and it has deployment, give a friendly unit, +1 attack, -1 op cost. Meh, no one cares. Really, they don't. Completely and utterly superfluous. I get a big attacking body that gives a brief buff, but it doesn't have blitz, and it doesn't do anything beyond that interesting on itself. It just gives a +1 buff and -1 operation cost. There are better ways to accelerate your damage in a Japan aggro archetype. This has been proven endlessly. The new card is hugely retooled. A completely different function. It's still an infantry, it's still limited. It still costs 3. It now has 0 operation cost. this will be relevant in a moment. It's 3/3, and it has Destruction, and deal damage to the enemy HQ equal to the credit slots you have lost this battle. Right, so we're into SKD, Self-Credit Denial. If you are not familiar with this deck, I've done videos. Self-Credit Denial is a genuinely playable mechanic as an archetype for Japan right now. There are ways that you can deny yourself credits to buy buffs later. There are a number of cards, One Roof, Great Expanse, which specifically go off this, and then there are units, like a 5th Cavalry, that gain buffs for doing it. Anyway, things to be aware of about SKD. One of the most important things in SKD is because you want to have one big swing turn a lot of the time off of the power of a One Roof, which is a card that gets you twice the amount of credits you've lost back for playing it, minus the 3 that it costs to play it. If you want the maths, I'm sure there's another video somewhere where I talk about it. In fact, I know there is in detail. But trust me, it can work. You just have to know what you're doing with it. But you want 0 op cost units because you want to have that big swing turn, draw cards, deploy a bunch of stuff, get a bunch of buffs going off things like the E3 Jake, which gives your units +1/+1 every time you deny yourself a credit. And the trick with this is that you get yourself a big pile of credits, deploy a bunch of stuff, all of which generally benefits from losing credits, and then deny yourself a whole bunch more credits to buff up the units. Net result, one big swing turn. This gives you a different way to advantage this. At 3 cost, this gives you a 3/3/0 op cost body, which you want later for your swing turn anyway, and deals damage to the enemy HQ equal to the credit slots you've lost this battle. Let us, for example, imagine that we've credit denied ourselves a couple of credits, and we're sitting around waiting to build up to being able to get a good... We're not there for a One Roof turn, and that will happen, because One Roof needs you to have denied yourself at least 3 credits, preferably more, to actually be good. So you have some lead time in which you don't want to overspend, because of course you've credit denied yourself, but you want to do something impactful. 3 cost, 3/3 body, deal 2 damage to the enemy HQ, that counts as something. It doesn't have Blitz, and if it did, it would be ridiculously OP, but it's also limited, so you can drop 3 of them. There are a number of ways that you can also do this. This is also going to interact really nicely with the 40th, which is the card which, when it's destroyed, reduces the cost of cards in your hand by 1. You deploy it, it denies you a credit slot, so it sets a trigger on this, then when it dies it makes this 1 cheaper. So if we can credit deny ourselves 2 credits, then deploy 2 40th, which both die, reducing the cost of each of these to 1, and denying ourselves another 2 credits, we then have 3 cards in our deck, which read, if they're in hand rather, that we have a number of them in hand. 3 is optimistic, but we might have 1 or 2. We'd certainly like to have 2, and those cards read 1 cost, 3/3, deployment, deal 4 damage to the enemy HQ. I'd play that card. I really would. And if you have a rough swing turn and end up short of destroying the enemy HQ, your enemy had better be aware as to how many of these you've still got in deck, because after you've had big swing turn and then gone up and then credit denied yourself all the way back down again, this could be 1 cost, this could be like 3 cost to win the game. Honestly, expect to see this card tried out. How good it will be, I don't know. But I personally enjoy self-credit denial because it is a very thinky deck, it involves a lot of maths, and it has multiple chains of play depending on the enemy that you're playing into, the way that your hand draws, and the way that the battle plays out. You have to change the way that you do the maths. To me, it's fascinating. To others, it is absolutely anathema, and I recognise that it is. But to me, it's fascinating, and this is another tool in that toolbox, which I think, well, after the nerfs, I'm not sad to see SKD get a little bump, because I think it's an archetype that I would like to see explored more, but that's me. I know some of you will not, and I respect that, and I've talked a lot about in other videos about this, respecting each other's views. This is not an archetype for everyone, but I personally think this is a very interesting card, and a good way to round out Japan, which we've just done. Okay, hi Sam, I know you've been waiting for us. We've arrived at Uncle Sam. Those of you who know my usual habit of doing things alphabetically will probably be raising an eyebrow at this point, because this should be where I'm doing the Soviet Union, but we're saving them till last, for a reason. Because I personally think they're in need of some love. We're going to address the US. Again, 3 cards to go through, so let's take a look at them. The first card that we have is the B-26 Marauder. This is a US bomber. The old version of the B-26 Marauder was a 4-cost, 2-operation cost, 3/4 bomber with heavy armour, and it says when this unit attacks an HQ, enemy units get +2 operation cost, and it's an elite. Hypothetically, this could be crippling. In actuality, it's just slow and removable and a bit meh. Not awful, but probably not matching up to a lot of the really good bombers that are already out there. So I don't think this is particularly strong as an elite. So let's see what the polish-up looks like, because that's what we actually care about, which is the version we're about to see in-game. Warning, it definitely changes the way you read this card. The new version is still a 4-cost, 2-operation cost, 3/4 bomber with heavy armour 1. The only change on this is its card text, but it's one hell of a change. Your non-targeting deployment effects trigger twice. Right. What's a non-targeting deployment effect? Any deployment effect that you don't have to pick a target for. This is a very strong tool in lots of ways. This is a buff to ramp, because this thing lets you... So let's talk about where this is most often going to see play and why I think I'm not a fan. Spoilers, I'm not. I don't think ramp needs a buff. But let's talk about where this is going to see play, and specifically how I think it's going to sequence. This will see play in US ramp. You'll see nothing on turn 1, because that's just the way it goes. It's US ramp. Then on turn 2, you'll see War Machine, which means that on turn 3, they have 4 credits. If you see this on turn 3, drop for 4 credits, and you're unable to remove it, the next thing you're going to see, in all likelihood, is just a rolling pile of milk trucks. So the card I'm talking about, and I'm going to pull up the full text of it so that I can talk about it appropriately. Excuse me while I find the card that I'm talking about. Is the 332nd Engineer Regiment. This is a 3-cost infantry, and it has a deployment effect, and that deployment effect is gain 1 credit slot and +2 HQ defense. Or, in this case, gain 2 credit slots and +4 HQ defense. No, let's not accelerate ramp anymore. Really? Yes, it's an elite, so this is going to be a niche thing, but you are never going to be sad to see this on curve on a ramp deck, because this takes the dial to 11. Seriously, turn 1, naffle, your ramp, you don't care. Turn 2, War Machine, your ramp, of course it's War Machine. Turn 3, B-26 Marauder, so you're at 4 credits on turn 3. turn 4, you now have 5 credits, 3 credits of which is the 332nd Engineers, which gives you another 2 credit slots. The next 2 credits might be War Machine, giving you another 1 on top of that, so that's 3 more credit slots, which turns turn 5 into turn 8. And yes, I'm getting animated. I've said this before, I'll say it again. A check needs to be put in place on credit acceleration. I'm not saying credit acceleration is a bad thing, it's a perfectly valid thing to do, but this is a nation that is getting already far too good at it. And no, this is not game-changing, because it's an elite. However, this thing can spawn off of Bomber Mafia, because it's a US bomber. Not a big thing, but it's pretty solid. Being aware of this, like non-targeted deployment effects. So this is also a thing. There aren't a lot of non-targeted deployment effects, but there are some. And those effects are ones to be aware of. This also creates an incredibly potent draw engine, because this doubles the number of cards you draw from Sherman. Not nothing. This double procs the B25 Mitchell. So B25 Mitchell now becomes deployment. Deal 3 damage to 2 random enemy units because it's non-targeted. P47, if you want to do it, becomes destroy 2 random units in the front line. The Mustang becomes deal 4 damage to 2 random enemy air units. The B-17 Flying Fortress becomes high-altitude bombing on deployment, which is not an unusual drop in ramp. In all seriousness, be cautious about this card and destroy it the minute you see it. Just make it go away. It's my only piece of advice. Yes, it's an elite, and I'm glad that it's an elite, but it's a very good one. For an archetype that, honestly, in my opinion, and again, it is just my opinion, but it's an archetype that didn't need it. Righty-ho! Next US card is Overwhelming Force. So, Overwhelming Force, the old version, is a 0-cost order. Standard card, so you can run 4 of them. Target unit loses guard, smokescreen, ambush, and destruction. Reset its attack. That's kind of suppress-ish. This has just been superseded. I'm not going to go into too much detail over this. Whether or not this is useful or not is not the point. The point is this was superseded by the existence of the Suppression card, and Duress basically is this but better. On the whole, fine, it rotated out, and it was probably never going to come back unless it was changed, so it's been changed. But as you may notice from the screen, it's kind of a big change. Overwhelming Force now costs 5. So it's a 5-cost order, and it says, choose and discard a unit. Give its attack and defense to a target friendly infantry or tank. Right. Before everyone leaps to the, this is a very situational thing, I really want to draw attention to the text of this card in specific, so no one misreads this. This says, choose and discard a unit. Not choose and discard a friendly unit, not choose and discard a unit from your hand. This allows you to pick the biggest, chostiest, most potent threat that your opponent has on the board, discard it, and give its attack and defense to one of your own units. Specifically an infantry or tank, which is a sensible limitation. This is a very strong late-game card. It's not going to be meta-breaking. I don't think it's going to proliferate the world, but I do think it's going to see play. It is very expensive. 5 is a lot to pay, but this is a big effect. A very big effect, because this neuters an enemy threat completely, discards an enemy card, and massively increases the output of one of your own. Played at the right time, this literally wins games, as you take your enemy's only defense, their last remaining guard, pitch it into a blender, add its attack and defense to the unit you've already got in the front line, and then beat their HQ down with it. Which, for 5 cost, doesn't suck. Keep an eye on this card. It's not as terrible as it may look at first sight. Bear's opinion, but there you go. Final US card. Oh look, it's another bomber. This is the A24 Banshee. This was a 4 cost, 2 operation cost, 3/4 heavy armor 1 bomber. It's vanilla as vanilla could be, and I suppose kind of defines the curve for this kind of cost of bomber, but not really in a good way, because it's completely uninteresting in every conceivable way. It's not a particularly strong body, it's not a particularly effective unit, and it's not really doing anything that you need to be aware of. Right. Rework time. It's now 6 cost, so expect a buff. Still 2 op cost. It's now a 3/3. Hang on. That's not a buff. Still heavy armor though. Deployment. Deal damage to a target unit equal to your unspent credits. Right. I don't like this card. I don't like this card on multiple levels. This card is useful to one and only one archetype, ramp. To that archetype, it is very useful. It's targeted damage. It's timeable. It will not be unusual for this to do between 4 and 6 damage, which is basically remove most anything you want. And it's only limited. Again, we have not seen the whole picture, and I will make sure I'm clear about that. I've not seen the balance changes. I am hopeful that these cards are suggestive that a number of the balance changes are going to be massive nerfs to ramp, because otherwise ramp is just being handed yet more tools. This card is way stronger than you think it is, because this card is not that expensive in the deck that plays it. In fact, in the deck that plays it, it's quite cheap. Anyway, it's just, part of it may be that I just think ramp is too strong right now and is too proliferate. But again, I think this is something to keep an eye on. I don't like this, your unspent credits do something for you when you already get something thing that is happening with ramp. Bomber Mafia does it, this does it, it just needs to stop. Ramp is already good. You're already way ahead of the curve, and you've just given it a bomber tool that allows it to accelerate even faster on clean curve. You've given it one of its, granted it's an elite, but you've just handed it its perfect turn 4 play. Just my opinion, but let's keep an eye on this, shall we, because I'm not convinced. Anyway, that's the US. It's pretty much ramp focused, in fact it's entirely ramp focused, which will shock no one. To the Soviet Union. Saved this for last. As many of you will know from my previous videos, I am unsurprisingly quite excited to take a look at these cards, because I have believed for some considerable time that the Soviet Union is in significant need of help. It has not been particularly strong and really is in need of some help, so let's see if it's getting it. The first card we're going to talk about is Men of Steel. Now, this is going to make me smile, because this card was discussed by myself and JKing7 on a video that we did, JKing's brainchild, of going back over the original OCC and having me evaluate cards and try and figure out, did they see play, how much play did they see, what did a meta look like. I'll probably put a link down below. It's worth going and having a look at that video. I think it's one of the more interesting and fun history of cards videos I've ever seen, and I really look forward to hopefully doing more of them because I had a blast doing it. But I need someone like J King to guide me through that because I wasn't there. He was. I personally rate that video. I think it's fun. Anyway, this card featured in that and it just reminded me of that. Let's focus there. Right. Men of Steel, the original. 1 cost order. Choose one. Your units get +1 heavy armor, or remove heavy armor from a unit. Special card. I mean, obviously the thing for this is to go plink, throw heavy armor on a bunch of small units to make them a bit more survivable, but it's not amazing. There's nothing super special about it. I'm not sure it particularly does anything that it's worth writing home about, which is probably why it retired quietly into the reserve pool. Right, so have we breathed some new life into this card with a rework? Well, let's find out. It's still a special, of course. It's still a 1 cost order. It now reads, choose 1. Your units get +1 heavy armor, or add the hammer to your hand. Right. Let's get the hammer out of the way first. The hammer is the, I think it's 3 cost Soviet order that does 6 damage to a ground unit. It just adds some removal to your hand as a secondary effect, but you're paying over the odds to get access to it, so you're paying 1 point for the versatility, which does sort of fit into the archetype that seems to be going around at the minute and was started by Retribution, which is adding versatility to cards, which is not terrible if done lightly, and in this case it's relatively lightly. It is more removal access in the game, and I'm not sure how much that's needed, but still, fine. And it's also not the primary effect of this card. Realistically, this card, funky art and all, is about trying to leverage heavy armor. Now, the Soviet Union does have quite a lot of units that either have or can leverage heavy armor. In particular, there's the Su-152, which when you deploy it gives your other tanks +1 attack and +1 heavy armor. There's the IL-2MPL, which is the Polish exile bomber that says a unit that has heavy armor survives combat, it gets +1/+1. And then there are a number of just tanks that have heavy armor. Things like the T-34-85, there's the Su-152, as I say, there's the T-34-76 Poland. These are all, like, the T-34s are a thing in and of themselves. This is going to go to being able to do one of two things. Either take light infantry or similar spawned cards and give them heavy armor to make them a bit more survivable, which is much less interesting, or to just make Soviet tanks and aircraft, as per the art, with heavy armor, better. Note, there's also the Sturmvorek, which is out there as well, and there are various other Soviet planes that you wouldn't object to seeing heavy armor on, because if you can get heavy armor on any form of bomber and have an IL-2M on the board, which I have done in some meme decks in the past, that can snowball hard too. On the whole, I don't think this is a game changer, but I do like it. I think it's interesting, and I think it is a buff for a Soviet archetype that really needed one. This might make some Soviet heavy tank builds viable-ish. Don't think it's going to make them meta, but it might make them viable. Next up, we have the Su-85. So the Su-85 was a 4-cost, 1-op cost tank that was 5/3, standard card, and it had deals double damage against tanks. It was a tank-busting tank. It's like an anti-tank tank that's ridiculously slow and is therefore basically useless. No offense, but it really is. Without Blitz, you can't operate it fast enough that you can guarantee its effect, and given that it only has 3 offense, it's just going to die. The new version is not that different. In fact, its stats and cost are identical. Still 4 cost, still 1-op cost, which is kind of nice in a tank with a big attack, but anyway, still 5/3. The new text, however, is very interesting. Your HQ gains +3 defense when you attack with a Soviet tank. This is an enabler. This card is quite exciting in the sense that it enables Soviet tanks to do something cool. Combine this with Men of Steel to give some more survivability to your tanks, and every time you attack with said tank, you're gaining HQ defense, which just keeps you alive while you just grind your opponent down. That's the archetype that this feeds into, and it feels a lot like old school green magic. From about, I wouldn't say old school green magic, because that was more about just exponential buffs, but there's a point at which green in Magic reached a point whereby there were some very strong grind decks, and this is grind. This is enabling an archetype that allows you to just outvalue and grind down your opponent, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because it's giving the Soviets yet another kind of core archetype, and there are cards that play into this. You've got plenty of Soviet tanks they're not amazing. But when they do this as well, they become a lot better. And that's kind of the thing. Just something to be aware of. I think this is clearly a lift. Again, this may very well point to things that we're going to see in the new expansion. As I've mentioned in previous parts of this discussion, it has been said in the article that some of these will tilt towards things we might see coming, and I hope this means that we're going to see a shift, a return to what I have referred to in the past, giving a spine, like a core pillar of building or two, back to the Soviets, because that's what they lack right now. The Soviets have a lot of objectively quite good cards, but they don't have a tree to build on. Making Soviet tanks good gives Soviets a spine. Making Soviet self-damage good again would give Soviets a spine. I wonder why he would mention self-damage. Guess who's back? Back again. Jokes aside, this is the KV2. Now, this card has been missed for a while for a specific reason, and I'll get to that. But let's start with the old version of this card. The KV2 is a 7-cost, 3-operation cost, or rather was a 7-cost, 3-operation cost, 6/5 tank with heavy armor 2, and cannot be pinned, cannot be attacked by artillery or air units, and is a special. Big chusty boy. Right. This card saw more play than you'd think, but not in the way that you think. This card saw play specifically because this was a 7-cost tank. And you needed one because the Soviet Union has an order called Stand Together. Stand Together is an order. It's 1 cost. And what Stand Together says is destroy a friendly infantry at a Soviet tank with the same cost, give it blitz. Right. The Soviet Union also has an infantry called the 34th Guards. 34th Guards, also a standard card, like Stand Together, is a 7-cost infantry, 7 cost, 1 op cost, 6/6, and it says, in your hand, this unit costs 2 less each time your HQ takes friendly damage. This was the heart, the beating heart of Soviet self-damage. You would have a 34th in hand. You would carry on doing your accelerating early unit self-damage stuff with the tanks that you deploy that deal damage to your HQ and stuff like that, and eventually you would have a 34th Guards in hand that cost nothing. You would then put it on the board. You would get it to the front line. Ideally, you would swing with it for 6 damage. Then you would play Stand Together. It's a 7-cost infantry. It's 7 cost, even though it's had a reduction. When it pops, it goes to look for a 7-cost tank, of which there is only one. the KV2, which puts a 3-op cost, 6 damage blitz tank on the board for free, which means you get to swing for 12. This worked. This was and had seen play. Even in the time I've been in the game, this has seen play. It is a good, solid combo. It's not game-breaking, but it is a good, solid combo when it kind of gave the punch at the end of what was the core Soviet archetype. Self-damage. Then KV2 got rotated, and there was a problem. 34th Guards was useless, because Stand Together does not say a tank of equal or lower cost. It says a tank of specifically that cost, and the Soviet Union has no 7-cost tanks. Which is why we're bringing this back. Factual statement. This is the only logical reason to bring this back, and boy did they bring it back. The new KV2, still 7 cost, only now it's only 2 operation cost. It's now 7-5, still has heavy armor 2, and it has a really strong effect. Order damage to friendly units reduced by its heavy armor. So order damage to a friendly unit, including itself, is reduced by its heavy armor. Heavy armor's one weakness is that it doesn't do anything to deal with removal and order damage. This thing suddenly starts reducing your order damage by 2 to it. And you've put it on the board for it. You're not going to see this card massively. It's highly unlikely you're going to see this card played as itself. You're going to see this card, this tank will spawn off Stand Together. It will hit the board, and then ideally you'll play Men of Steel. Because then all of the quick board wipes that your opponent can fling out do less damage. I love this change. I love this return. I think this is a well-suited and well-needed buff to the Soviet thing, and the thing I love most about this is not the new text effect. It's not the fact that it takes the damage from that swing turn from 12 to 13. It's the fact that this reduces the cost of that swing turn by 1 because it's now only operation cost 2, and that's huge. Something to be aware of. That is massive, because now that 34th Guard swing turn is cheaper, which means you have more credits with which to do other things, which is always the thing. Soviets have always suffered from being slow, and anything that accelerates them just a little bit into what they do is, for me, good. I love this change, I encourage this change, I welcome the arrival of it. There will be plenty of people who don't, because lots of people did not like suffering the Stand Together combo. Personally, I kind of applauded any opponent who actually managed to pull it off against me, because it's kind of cool. And it's really the thing that Soviets do. This is not bad. This is a good set of cards for Soviets. It's not all that I want to see. I'm hoping the balance changes will also see some significant stuff. I've heard rumblings that there might be some really cool stuff coming. Anyway, we'll see that when we get to that reveal. But yeah, I'm very happy about this, and I think many Soviet players will be too. So we've wrapped up the main nations. We do have 3 more cards, because we have to do the allies. So let's get to it. Allons-y. France. So this is the one card that we will see for France. We're seeing 1 for each ally nation that is not Finland, because Finland has no reserved cards. This is Sabotage. It's a limited card. The old version of Sabotage was a 2-cost order, and it said deal damage to any target equal to 1 plus the number of resistance cards in an enemy hand. There is no point in me going into this, because resistance isn't a thing anymore. Kind of still exists. There are, I think there's like 1 or 2 cards left that still do it, using like Frappe and stuff, but ultimately, but resistance was a thing, it isn't anymore. This was basically vestigial and unimportant. Like, the only thing that was useful about this is, of course, that it would target anything, which meant that if you could stack your opponent's cards with resistance cards, which you could do, there were ways of doing it, you could then deal damage to your opponent's HQ equal to the number of resistance cards that you see where this is going. If you want to go look it up, and if you want to talk about it, talk to someone like J. King. I think he played a fair chunk of this. On to the new version, because this just needs a complete rewrite, and it got one. Oh boy, did it get one. The new version is a 7-cost order, so expect it to be punchy. Choose one of 3 cards in the enemy hand. Discard it and add a copy to your hand. Right, this card is bonkers. It's expensive, but I don't care. It's so good. This card does so many things. 1. It lets me see 3 cards in my enemy's hand, which will quite often be a good chunk of my enemy's hand, although sometimes not. 2. It lets me pick the one I don't want to deal with and blender it. But also, I get a copy, so if I don't see one that I'm overly worried about, but I do see one that would be amazingly good for me, yoink, blender. This is inverse develop, which is interesting. It's very expensive, but it's potent. It's co-belligerence, similar card, targets a unit, shuffles it into your deck. This is better because it adds the card to your hand, and also discards your opponent's copy. Co-belligerence obviously just straight up steals it. Overall, I'm not a massive fan of stealing mechanics. I've said this before. But as a card, this is very strong. Expect it to see some play. I think particularly US, if it's still around, if there isn't a nerf to it, this will probably see play in some mill decks, because it lets you go fishing for cards that might give you a problem, pitch them, and blow your opponent's deck size by 1. Granted, you then have to refill their hand and stuff, but you're doing that anyway. Honestly, this is quite strong. I think it's well costed though, so I'm not sure it's going to break the game. To Italy, and I am delighted to say that we are seeing an Italian aircraft, because I personally think Italian aircraft are pretty, and also the art for them in this game is very cool. This is the Savoia Marchetti SM-79. This was, let's start with the was, as ever, a 4-cost, 2-operation cost, 5/3 bomber. Limited card, and it said reduce the attack of this unit by 1 each time a friendly unit is destroyed to a minimum of 1. This is a ridiculously fiddly thing, and also I know something that would be a nightmare to program, because this is changing itself in deck. It's something you can only do in a digital card game, because otherwise record keeping's a nightmare, but it's just awful. It's clunky, it's ineffective, it's expensive. Let's really hope they fixed it. Not going to go into it beyond that. I also totally understand why they want to get rid of too many mechanics that change card stats while they're in deck. Alright, the new version. Still a 4-cost, 2-op cost bomber. It's now 3/3, so it's much less punchy. However, it has deployment. Trigger a non-targeted deployment effect on a friendly unit. Right, so this is a card of 2 halves, because there are 2 things about this card. The first thing about this card is it is currently largely indifferent, because you need an ally nation that has a good triggerable non-targeted deployment effect that you can trigger, and you could mess about and stack it with US bomber that doubles the number of times it triggers, and all of that stuff. Sure, fine, but that's not going to be a big thing at the minute because there isn't that much of it around, and Italy itself is not loaded with non-targeted deployment effects. But, as I've mentioned before, there's another one of those cards that tells me that we can expect to see something new coming for Italy in the next expansion, and that something new may very well be to do with non-targeted effects. We might get some deployment effect Italy units that are interesting. They might even be Alpine related. I know nothing. I want to be clear about that. I have no advanced knowledge, but that would be interesting. To me, anyway, because it would allow you to go back into to Alpine and go with it, and do something interesting. As it is, I mean, there are a couple of things in Italy that it targets. I mean, honestly, it would affect. Would it affect? So the question is whether the Fiat CR 42 counts as targeted. It's a deployment effect that Italy does have access to, and it gets +1 attack if you control more units than the enemy. It is a deployment effect. Would it trigger twice? I wonder. Not really relevant, but I'm just having a quick look to see if there's anything else that I wanted to have a look at. Deployment effect was totally pointless on the M13. Yeah, as I mentioned, there is nothing in here that is particularly exciting. Although, Fiat BR20, if you're an Alpine player, is interesting. Because it fills your support line. Because instead of getting 2 third Alpini, you get 3. Because obviously you've deployed the BR20, so you can't get 4. It's just a thing to be aware of. And that's interesting to me. Anyway, as I say, I think this points to where Italy might be going, and that's always interesting. As a card on its own, even in the article, they call out there's a card on its own. It's not particularly exciting or interesting right now, but watch this space. Okay, kids, we're rounding third if you're an American. We're on the home stretch. This is the last card that we'll be addressing today. This is the Poland card, and this is Hell. Sorry, I had to do it. Right. Hell was a 1-cost special order that said, Intel 1, your Legion units get, as in you add to your Legion units, gets +1/+1 when it survives combat. This was just a global buff to your Legion's units, so that if your Legion's units survived combat, they'd snowball a bit. Did it see play a little bit? Was it amazingly good? Situationally, sometimes, maybe, but ultimately, And Poland has some very good cards, and if you're running Legions, you already have a lot of good cards that you want to put in your deck, and you only have 12 slots. So it wasn't a massively good card. Polishing up, let's see. 2 cost now, so presumably it's been buffed. 2 cost order. It says, give a Legion's unit +6 defense and your HQ is immune to damage. Right. This card is immensely situational, which means I instantaneously don't like it. I wish that I could be more excited by this card, because immune to damage on your HQ is cool. +6 defense on a unit means it should probably hang around for a while, although there is hard removal in this game. And Legions does get bigger, but at 2 cost in an already incredibly competitive ally, I don't think this is going to make waves. I really don't. It's fine, but it's not going to make massive waves. It might see a little bit of play, particularly if you feel like you're going to be wanting to do it. But really, your Legions already has guards, so it's only really working against targeted damage like order spam or commandos, I suppose, random damage, or order-based damage, or bombers. So, it's very much a tech tool. It might see the occasional include in tournament lists if the meta leans a certain way and this direct HQ damage becomes a thing. But on the face of it, I'm not overwhelmed. I don't think this card's going to do anything particularly exciting. But it does round out our selection of cards, which is always cool. We got there. So that's it. That is the information that we have, the card changes, the returning cards that we're going to see, and my opinions on them. This video is long. It will be slightly shorter when I edit it, but it is long. I hope you found it useful, interesting, and enjoy it. As ever, if you do find it interesting or have opinions and want to do them, you can pop them in the comments. You can look in the description and join my Discord and come talk to me directly. You can @me on the Cards Discord. You can find me on social media. I am generally available and quite sociable. Always interested to talk about stuff like this. In the meantime, as ever, stay well, be good human beings, and I'll catch you next time.